The billionaire thought he buried his wife, but the moment he saw her alive at a crowded farmer's market, choosing peaches like nothing had ever happened, the world he built with money, power, and certainty cracked beneath his feet. Daniel Whitmore wasn't just wealthy, he was a self-made billionaire. A man who turned a biotech startup into an empire. A husband who once promised his wife forever. 3 years earlier, he had stood at her grave, watched her coffin lowered into the earth, and listened to the thud of dirt sealing what he believed was the end of their love story. He signed the papers. He accepted the condolences. He carried the grief, but grief is final. And what he saw at that farmer's market was not. Under striped tents and late summer sunlight, his wife, the woman he had buried, was laughing softly at a produce stand. A woven basket looped over her arm, her wedding scar visible on her wrist. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't running. She looked peaceful. She looked alive. Daniel stopped breathing. Billionaires don't believe in ghosts. They believe in contracts, in facts, in death certificates stamped and sealed. He had identified her body. He had paid for the funeral. He had watched the casket disappear into the ground. But she was there. At a farmer's market. Alive. When he whispered her name, she froze, not like someone shocked to see a stranger, but like someone who had always known this day might come. And then she said something that made his blood run cold. You weren't supposed to find me. If the billionaire buried his wife, who did he put in that grave? If she is alive at that farmer's market, why did she let him mourn her for 3 years? And what truth was so dangerous that death seemed safer than staying married to a billionaire? Daniel Whitmore had trained himself never to freeze. Boardrooms worth billions had hardened him. He had negotiated mergers that shifted pharmaceutical markets across continents, had faced hostile investors who smiled while trying to dismantle his company, had survived lawsuits that could have shattered lesser men. His name appeared on financial covers beside words like visionary, disruptor, empire builder. His net worth hovered in the billions, fluctuating with stock surges and acquisition rumors. But none of that prepared him for the sight of his buried wife standing 10 feet away at a farmer's market in Willow Creek. He had come reluctantly. The Whitmore Biotech Agricultural Outreach Grant required a public appearance. Cameras, ribbon cutting, smiles. His assistant Mark Reynolds had insisted. It's good optics, Daniel. Small towns trust faces they see, Mark had said in the car, tablet glowing with schedules and press notes. Daniel had stared out the tinted window of his black electric sedan, watching fields blur past. You know I hate farmers' markets. Mark had hesitated. He knew why. Everyone close to Daniel knew. It's just an hour, he replied carefully, because farmers' markets had been Evelyn's world. Evelyn Whitmore, born Evelyn Harper, had never cared about galas or stock prices. She came from a modest vineyard family in Sonoma, raised among soil and seasons, taught that growth required patience. She had met Daniel before he was a billionaire. Back when he rented lab space above a failing bakery and slept for hours a night chasing a compound he believed could treat autoimmune disorders. She had believed in him before investors did. Flashbacks flickered through him now as he stared at the woman by the peaches. Evelyn, barefoot in their first apartment kitchen, flour on her cheek, laughing at his failed attempt to cook. Evelyn standing beside him the day Whitmore Biotech went public, squeezing his hand as cameras flashed. Evelyn arguing softly one night in their glass-walled dining room, sunset bleeding across the hills. Daniel, this merger isn't clean. Something feels wrong. He had dismissed it then, but the memory pressed harder now. She had always trusted instinct over spreadsheets. The woman at the stall lifted a peach, weighing it in her palm. Sunlight caught auburn strands in her hair. A faint crescent scar marked her wrist, the result of a shattered bottle during a college harvest festival. Daniel had stitched that wound himself while waiting for paramedics. Hands shaking but determined. No one else knew that scar's exact curve. No one. He stepped closer. The vendor, an elderly man with dirt-stained nails, chuckled. You won't find sweeter fruit in the county. She smiled. Sweet isn't the same as honest. That line hit him like a physical blow. Evelyn used to say that about corporate philanthropy. Daniel's throat tightened. Evelyn, the name left him before logic could intervene. She went still. A child knocked over a crate nearby. Apples rolled across pavement. People bent to gather them. The ordinary rhythm of life continued, indifferent to the earthquake inside him. Slowly, she turned. Their eyes met. Recognition sparked, not confusion, not fear. Recognition layered with something heavier. Regret. Daniel, she said quietly, his voice fractured. You're dead. 3 years earlier, He had stood in black beside her mother, Margaret Harper, as a priest recited final rites. The casket had remained closed. The coroner had explained gently, severe facial trauma from the cliff impact. Identification had been confirmed through dental records and personal effects. Daniel had been ushered through paperwork while numbness shielded him from detail. He remembered signing the burial authorization, remembered Margaret insisting on a traditional burial instead of cremation, remembered thinking it didn't matter, she was gone either way. But now she stood breathing in front of him. She scanned the area subtly, exits, faces, distance. Evelyn had always observed like that, a habit formed from years of navigating elite charity circles where smiles masked agendas. "You weren't supposed to find me," she said, before he could reach for her. She turned and walked into the moving crowd. Not running. Deliberate. Mark appeared at his side. "Daniel, the press is assembling." Daniel didn't answer, because if the billionaire buried his wife, and she was alive at a farmer's market, then either the world had deceived him or she had, and if she had chosen to disappear from a billionaire husband with unlimited resources, what had she been protecting him from? Or who? Daniel did not go to the press booth. For the first time in years, Whitmore Biotech's billionaire founder ignored a line of cameras waiting for his smile. "Cancel it," he said quietly. Mark blinked. "Daniel, the mayor is here." The grand check. "Cancel it." There was something in Daniel's voice Mark had only heard once before, the day Evelyn's accident was reported. A hollowed tone, controlled, but splintering underneath. Mark nodded and stepped away to manage the fallout. He had worked for Daniel for 8 years. He knew how to read markets. He knew how to read shareholders. But he had never known how to read grief. Daniel moved through the market crowd. Eyes scanning, pulse hammering. He had built an empire by recognizing patterns, supply chains, market behaviors, subtle shifts in competitor strategy. Now he analyzed this moment the same way. She hadn't looked surprised. She hadn't looked afraid. She had looked resigned. That detail lodged deep. If she were truly hiding, she would have run. If she were an imposter, she would have denied knowing him. But she had said his name. Daniel exited the main square and turned down a quieter side path lined with food trucks and artisan stands. He caught a glimpse of auburn hair disappearing behind a produce truck. "Evelyn." His voice was sharper now. She stopped this time. Slowly, she turned back. Up close, the resemblance wasn't resemblance at all. It was her. The same faint line between her brows when she was thinking. The same steadiness in her posture. The same small inhale before speaking. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "I buried you." The words came out raw. Silence stretched between them, thick with 3 lost years. 3 years earlier the phone call had come at 217 Highway Patrol. Coastal Road. Vehicle over the cliff. Daniel had arrived before sunrise, suit jacket thrown over a t-shirt, hair uncombed. He remembered the twisted guardrail, the smell of salt and gasoline, the officer's careful tone. "Brake line failure appears likely." At the time, it had sounded like tragic randomness, but Evelyn had mentioned brake concerns days before. A faint grinding sound when descending hills. Daniel had told her he'd have the car serviced. He had forgotten. The memory struck him now with surgical precision. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" he asked. Her jaw tightened. "Do I look like I'm joking?" He studied her face. There were subtle changes, a slight tan, faint lines near her eyes. Time had moved for her. Not in hiding, but in living. "How?" he demanded. "I identified you." She looked away briefly at that. A flicker of something, guilt, pain. "You identified what they showed you," she replied carefully. That sentence cracked open a new possibility. Daniel's mind moved fast. The coroner had discouraged viewing. "Severe trauma," they said. Dental records confirmed. Personal jewelry recovered from the wreckage. He remembered signing documents in a sterile office while Margaret Harper clutched a handkerchief beside him. Margaret had insisted on burial instead of cremation, a Harper family tradition rooted in soil and continuity. If there had been a mistake, it would have required more than accident. "You're telling me the body wasn't yours?" Daniel asked. "I'm telling you," she said slowly, "that what happened 3 years ago wasn't an accident." The world narrowed again. Not an accident. Daniel's empire had enemies, lawsuits, competitors, short sellers. But none of that intersected with Evelyn. She had kept distance from corporate operations after the merger debate. The merger. Another memory rose. Evelyn standing in his office late one evening, holding a folder. "Daniel, this company you're merging with, their pediatric trial data doesn't add up." He had sighed, tired. "We've audited everything." "Not this," she insisted. He had promised to look. He hadn't. Talk to me, he said now, voice lower. Right now. A black SUV rolled slowly past the end of the street, tinted windows reflecting sunlight. Evelyn's eyes flicked toward it instinctively, a reflex, not fear, awareness. Foreshadowing tightened the air. We can't do this here, she said. Can't. His billionaire instinct bristled at the word. She met his gaze steadily. You think money solves everything, Daniel. But some things money almost destroyed. That landed harder than accusation. Because 3 years ago, Whitmore Biotech's merger had tripled his net worth. And 2 weeks after Evelyn questioned it, her brakes had failed. Daniel felt something shift inside him. If you're alive, he said carefully, then someone wanted me to believe you were dead. Yes. Why? Her silence was longer this time, because the answer wasn't small. And whatever it was, it had been worth letting a billionaire husband bury his wife. She stepped back slightly. Meet me tonight. 7 o'clock. The old greenhouse outside town. The Harper greenhouse. He asked automatically. A flicker of memory passed. Between them, their first kiss there during harvest season. Yes, she said. Then she turned and walked away again. Daniel didn't follow this time, because if this was bigger than grief, then tonight would not just answer who was in that grave. It would answer who had orchestrated it. And why Evelyn believed death was safer than staying married to him. Daniel did not return to the city after the market. For the first time in 3 years, he postponed a shareholder call without explanation. Mark tried once. Daniel, the board is asking why you canceled the appearance. Social media already picked it up. Tell them I had a personal emergency. There was a pause on the line. Is this about her? Daniel didn't answer. He ended the call. He sat alone inside the rented town car, parked beneath a row of sycamores just outside Willow Creek. The town looked unchanged from the last time he had visited with Evelyn. Modest storefronts, hand-painted signs, children riding bikes without urgency. She had loved places like this. Said they felt honest. Honest. That word echoed again. Daniel leaned back and closed his eyes, forcing his mind to slow down. He had built Whitmore Biotech by separating emotion from analysis. He would do the same. Now. Fact. He identified a body 3 years ago. Fact. The coroner cited severe facial trauma from a cliff impact. Fact. Dental records confirmed identity. Fact. Evelyn's car was found at the base of the coastal ravine. Fact. She is alive. One of those facts had been manipulated. His mind returned to that night. He had been in New York negotiating final merger terms when Evelyn called. I need to see you, she had said. I'm in meetings all day. It's about the trial data. He had rubbed his forehead. Evelyn, we've gone through this. Daniel, she had insisted softly, if we merge before federal review, and something's wrong, we won't just lose money. Children could get hurt. He remembered glancing at the skyline outside his hotel window. Investors were pressuring him. Competitors were circling. The merger would secure dominance in neurological therapeutics. Trust me, he told her. There had been silence on the line then. Not anger, disappointment. 2 nights later, her brakes failed. Daniel opened his eyes sharply. The timing had never set right. But grief had muted suspicion. Now suspicion roared back. He pulled out his phone and called an old contact, Victor Hale, former federal prosecutor turned private legal strategist. Daniel had hired him once to navigate a regulatory storm. Victor answered on the second ring. Daniel Whitmore, you don't call unless something's on fire. I need you to revisit a case. 3 years ago. My wife's accident. A pause. Papers shuffling. I remember. Brake failure. Closed investigation. I want the full file. Not summaries. Everything. Coroner reports. Dental confirmations. Forensic breakdown. Victor exhaled slowly. Why now? Because I just saw her. Silence. Daniel. Grief can. She spoke to me, Victor. Another pause, longer this time. Victor was not a man prone to fantasy. Where? At a farmer's market in Willow Creek. And you're certain? I stitched the scar on her wrist myself. That ended the doubt. Victor's tone shifted. If what you're saying is true, then we're not talking about misidentification. We're talking about intentional substitution. Yes. And that, Victor said carefully, would require coordination. Law enforcement or someone capable of manipulating it. Daniel's jaw tightened. Or someone powerful enough to buy it. He ended the call and stepped out of the car. The Harper greenhouse stood on the edge of town, half hidden by overgrown vines. It had belonged to Evelyn's father before cancer hollowed him out and left her inheriting both the structure and the soil. Daniel had helped repair its glass panels during their first year of marriage. Hands blistered but proud. Back then, he had not yet become a billionaire. Back then, he still believed success meant building something clean. As he approached the greenhouse, memory layered over the present. Evelyn kneeling in dirt rose, explaining how root systems communicate underground. Plants warn each other, she had said. They send signals before danger spreads. What does that have to do with biotech? He had teased. Everything, she replied. He hadn't understood then. He pushed open the greenhouse door. Dust floated in amber light. The air smelled like earth and memory. At exactly 7 o'clock. Footsteps sounded behind him. He turned. Evelyn stood in the doorway. Not a ghost, not an illusion. Alive. For a long moment. Neither spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. If this wasn't an accident, he said evenly. Then start at the beginning. She stepped inside and closed the door softly behind her. The beginning, she said, was the merger. Daniel felt the ground shift again. Tell me everything, he said. And this time he meant it. Daniel watched her carefully as she walked deeper into the greenhouse. Sunlight cutting through the dusty panes and catching on the auburn strands of her hair. Every step she took was deliberate, measured, as if rehearsed. It was Evelyn. The Evelyn he had loved, argued with, laughed with, but also the Evelyn who had disappeared from his life entirely. Start from the beginning, he said again, trying to keep his voice steady. She inhaled slowly, scanning the rows of wilting plants and scattered clay pots. The beginning isn't simple, he nodded. He had built a career parsing complexities, finding patterns where others saw chaos. This would be no different. 3 years earlier, Evelyn had discovered discrepancies in the data for the pediatric medication Whitmore Biotech was about to acquire. The trials had been fast-tracked to maximize stock valuation before the merger. She had stumbled upon abnormal neurological readings, subtle anomalies hidden within layers of charts and charts of numbers. She had brought the findings to Daniel in the quiet of their penthouse kitchen. Daniel, she had said, her voice sharp with urgency, this isn't just a statistic. Kids could get hurt. Daniel remembered his response perfectly. He had been exhausted, stressed, consumed with investor calls. We've audited everything, he had said. You haven't audited this, she replied, tapping the folder with her finger. It's being suppressed. Her words had burned then, and they burned now in his memory. He had promised to look. He hadn't. And now she was standing before him, alive. I left, she said softly. Because I had to. Because if I stayed. Her eyes flicked toward the cracked glass panes, toward the rows of plants that smelled faintly of rain. You would have been implicated. You didn't see the danger then, but I did. Daniel's jaw clenched. You disappeared. Let me grieve. Let me bury you. I paid my respects. I know, she said, voice breaking. I watched your funeral from a distance. I watched you crumble. But it was necessary. You would have destroyed the evidence, or worse, your hands could have been tied when they needed to be free. He felt a mix of rage, guilt, and disbelief swirl in him. He had believed in control, in precision, in power. Yet here was Evelyn, proving that control had its limits, and power alone couldn't protect what mattered. I had a choice, she continued, to disappear, to ensure they never traced the manipulation back to you. And I took it. It meant letting everyone believe I was dead, including you. Daniel's eyes narrowed. They, who? The executives behind the merger, the ones who falsified reports. They wanted the pediatric trials hidden. If the merger went through unchallenged, she let the thought hang in the air. And you took the fall instead? He asked, his voice quieter, raw with emotion. I survived, she said, a small bitter smile crossing her lips, because I had to protect you. But staying would have destroyed us both. You weren't ready to see the truth. Daniel remembered the funeral, the closed casket, the whispered condolences, the pit in his stomach that refused to leave. Every detail suddenly made sense. The coroner's evasive answers, the minor discrepancies in reports, the quick burial. It was all orchestrated. But why the farmer's market? He asked finally, voice tight. She smiled faintly. Because it's where I felt closest to life again, where I could see the world as it should be. And I knew you might come. Daniel swallowed. Questions whirled in his mind. How could she orchestrate this? How had she disappeared so completely? And if she had survived, what else had he missed while chasing numbers and contracts? You're alive, he whispered, more to himself than to her. Yes, she said. Alive, and I'm telling you now because the time for hiding is over. He stepped closer. The air between them thickened, charged with 3 years of absence, grief, and unresolved tension. He remembered their early days, the vineyard in Sonoma, the harvest festivals, the laughter in small kitchens. Her voice had once filled rooms, had reminded him of what mattered beyond balance sheets and stock tickers. And now she was back. Not a ghost, not a memory, but real. Daniel realized the magnitude of what she had done. She hadn't just survived. She had protected him, the company, and the children whose lives might have been harmed. Every choice, every step, had been calculated, sacrificial, and almost unimaginable. "I need to know everything," he said. "Every move, every plan, every risk you took to disappear." She nodded. "Then let me start with the merger. Everything else flows from that." Daniel exhaled slowly. For the first time in 3 years, he felt alive, terrified, and utterly dependent on the woman he thought he had buried. Daniel followed Evelyn into the narrow center aisle of the greenhouse, the scent of damp soil and crushed leaves filling his senses. Dust motes drifted in the sunlight like memories suspended in time, each one a reminder of a life he thought had ended. He watched her carefully, noting the way she moved, graceful, deliberate, aware of every shadow, every potential observer. She had not changed, and yet, the weight of 3 years had carved subtle lines into her face, lines Daniel had never imagined tracing. "Why now?" he asked, his voice low, carrying the tension of years of unanswered questions. "Why show me after all this time?" Evelyn paused near a row of heirloom tomato plants, brushing her fingers lightly over their leaves as though drawing reassurance from their vitality. "Because the time is right," she said softly. "The people who threatened us, they've been caught. The investigation is complete. It was always about timing, Daniel. I had to disappear to ensure it finished safely." Her words triggered a flashback. 3 years ago, she had been in their penthouse at night, reviewing merger documents with painstaking detail. Daniel had been exhausted, pacing the kitchen floor, counting hours to a board meeting. "Daniel," she had said, pointing to inconsistencies in the data. "Look at this. Pediatric trial results. They've been suppressed. Children's side effects hidden. If this goes through, I've heard you," he had snapped, weary and distracted. "We can't stop the merger now. Too much is at stake." The memory cut deep. He had dismissed her instinct, prioritizing stock prices over lives. That decision had set everything in motion. Evelyn's sudden disappearance had been a shock, but now it made sense. She had been protecting him from his own ambition, from consequences he had not even imagined. "I had to let them think I was dead," she continued, her voice steady but tinged with sorrow, "so they wouldn't touch you, the company, or anyone connected to it. Every step, every choice. It was calculated." Daniel swallowed, feeling a mix of anger, relief, and awe. "And the funeral. The grave? I watched you lowered into the earth with my own hands, Evelyn. My grief was real. Every tear I shed." His voice cracked. "Why? Why let me believe that?" She looked at him then, eyes glistening. "Because the truth would have put you in danger. You would have been too close. You would have interfered unknowingly. It was safer for you to grieve, for me to vanish, and for the right people to dismantle the corruption." Another memory emerged. The night before her accident, Evelyn had driven them along the coastal road, testing a new car she had purchased herself. She had muttered about a faint grinding noise in the brakes, which he had dismissed in his preoccupation with investor meetings. She had been cautious, aware, prepared for things he couldn't yet see. "And now?" Daniel asked, his gaze steady, voice sharper. "Now that it's over, why appear at a farmer's market?" She smiled faintly, brushing a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. "Because life is quieter there, realer. People grow things, sell things, live with their hands and hearts. It reminded me of what I was fighting for and of what I wanted to protect in you." Daniel stepped closer, the old ache of longing mingled with awe. "And me? Did I matter in all this?" She nodded slowly. "Always. That's why I left. That's why I came back. You needed to see it unfold, to understand, but not at the cost of your life or your conscience." For the first time in 3 years, Daniel felt his mind clear, even as emotions churned. The woman he had buried, the one he had mourned, had orchestrated an elaborate plan of survival and protection. Every detail from her disappearance to her reemergence was precise, layered with foresight, and woven to safeguard him and everyone he cared about. The greenhouse seemed smaller now, more intimate. Dust-laden sunlight reflected in her eyes, and he saw not just Evelyn, but the weight of the past 3 years, the sacrifices she had made silently, and the lives she had saved along the way. "I need to know everything," he said quietly. "Every step, every choice, every risk you took to vanish." She looked down, tracing the veins of a tomato leaf with her finger. Then listen carefully, she said, because the story begins with the merger, and everything else follows from there. Daniel followed Evelyn out of the greenhouse into the fading light of late afternoon. The air smelled of soil and sunlight, grounding him in a reality he hadn't felt in years. The town of Willow Creek stretched quietly around them, modest storefronts, unpaved alleys, children's laughter echoing faintly from a nearby park. It was the kind of place Evelyn had always loved, simple, honest, real. And it was the first time in 3 years that Daniel felt a connection to life outside his boardrooms and skyscrapers. I need to understand everything, he said as they walked. Every decision you made, every step you took while the world thought you were dead. She glanced at him, eyes shadowed but resolute. You've always trusted data, Daniel. Patterns, numbers, logic. But some truths can't be measured on a spreadsheet. He frowned. Explain. She led him to a small, abandoned barn at the edge of a vineyard that had belonged to her father. He remembered standing there years ago, sleeves rolled up, hands caked in dirt, as she demonstrated grafting techniques and soil testing. The place smelled of hay and wood and memories. 3 years ago, she began, I discovered irregularities in the merger partner's pediatric trial data. Children were experiencing neurological side effects that weren't being reported. You didn't see it, but I did. And I knew you would be pressured to finalize the merger before regulatory review. You wouldn't have stopped it. You would have believed the audit. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He remembered the night she had confronted him in the penthouse kitchen, folder in hand, voice trembling with urgency. Daniel, this isn't just numbers. Kids could get hurt. I told you, he remembered replying. We've audited everything. And you didn't see it, she said now, voice quiet but sharp. That's why I left. To protect you from being implicated. To protect the children. To protect the company. He shook his head, disbelief and anger twisting together. So you faked your death? Yes, she admitted. But it wasn't enough just to disappear. I had to make sure everything was documented, monitored, and dismantled correctly. I became invisible, but every move I made was calculated. Daniel's mind raced. The coroner's evasive answers, the sealed casket, the misidentified remains, all of it suddenly clicked into place. Someone had orchestrated a misidentification, and she had used it to protect him and her mission. You weren't just alive, he said, voice breaking. You were. Planning, surviving, fighting. Yes, she said. And watching you grieve. That was the hardest part. I had to let you mourn, to keep you safe. I watched the funeral from a distance. Every detail, every tear, I saw it all. And I knew you'd believe it because it had to be real to protect you. He swallowed, the weight of realization pressing down. All this, you protected me? From what exactly? She hesitated, glancing toward the horizon. From the people who wanted to hide the truth, from the executives manipulating data, and from the consequences you couldn't yet see. The merger wasn't just about money. It was about control, deception, lives. Daniel felt his world shift. The empire he had built, the choices he had made, the ambition that had consumed him, all of it had been blind to the danger she had seen. And she had carried that burden alone. Why come back now? He asked finally. Why appear at a farmer's market? Why here? She smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Because this is where life feels honest, where growth is tangible, where I could stand without fear and still be myself. And because I knew you might follow the instincts I planted in you without even realizing it. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders loosening slightly. For the first time, he saw her not just as the woman he had buried but as the strategist, protector, and survivor she had become. Every choice, every sacrifice, had been deliberate. Then start from the beginning, he said. Tell me everything. No gaps, no assumptions. I need to understand it all. She nodded, eyes steady. Then listen carefully. It all starts with the merger, and everything else follows from there. Daniel sat across from Evelyn at a small wooden table inside the barn, dust motes drifting lazily in the fading light like ghosts of the past. He studied her face, the same familiar features, the same sharp eyes, but tempered now with quiet steel. The woman he thought dead had returned, and the weight of her absence pressed on him like a physical force. Start from the beginning, he said again. I need dates, names, actions, every detail. Evelyn nodded, taking a deep breath. It began months before the merger. I noticed discrepancies in the pediatric trial data. Early neurological reports were inconsistent with what the executives submitted. Side effects were underreported, and some children weren't followed up with. I brought it to you first, Daniel remembered the confrontation vividly. It had been late in their penthouse kitchen, rain streaking the city lights outside. "Daniel, you have to see this," she had said, urgency threading her voice. He had brushed it off, tired and distracted, focused on investor calls and stock projections. "We can't stop the merger now," he had said. "And that's when I realized," she continued, "that staying would be dangerous. Not for me, not entirely, but for you. The people manipulating the data had a network of influence. If I stayed, you would have been implicated, whether you realized it or not." Daniel's stomach churned. The coroner's vague reports, the sealed casket, Margaret Harper's insistence on a traditional burial, it all clicked. Someone had orchestrated every step, and Evelyn had used her disappearance to shield him. 3 years, he said quietly. 3 years of thinking you were gone. Why not tell me sooner? Because timing was everything, she replied. The investigation needed to reach its conclusion without interference. I had to monitor it from the shadows. If I had surfaced, they would have stopped me, or worse, targeted you directly. Daniel felt a flicker of anger. And the market, the farmer's market, was that some kind of test? Evelyn's eyes softened. Not a test, a signal, a way to let you see me alive without forcing confrontation. I needed you to feel the reality of my survival before the truth unfolded. He recalled the moment vividly. The peach stall, her voice cutting through the noise. "You weren't supposed to find me." That line had hit him harder than anything else. It was simple, direct, but layered with danger, guilt, and survival. "Do you realize what I've endured?" he asked, voice trembling. "Watching your funeral, signing the burial papers, accepting condolences while my world felt empty." "I know," she said softly. "And I watched from a distance. Every tear you shed, every sleepless night. I never stopped caring. I never stopped watching. But I couldn't risk appearing until it was safe." Daniel's mind spiraled. The merger, the manipulated data, her disappearance, it was all connected. Every choice, every step, had been a calculated move in a game of life and death. "Who else knows?" he asked, leaning closer. "Who orchestrated this? Who falsified the reports?" Her gaze darkened. "Executives within the merger partners company. A network of people willing to sacrifice ethics for profit. They underestimated me and they assumed death would silence me. And you survived," Daniel whispered. "Alone." "Yes," she said, voice barely audible. "Alone, but always aware, always planning. Every move I made was to dismantle their control without touching you." He exhaled slowly, absorbing the depth of her sacrifice. She had not only protected him but countless children, their families, and the integrity of the company he had built. "I need to know every step," he said firmly. "Everything. No omissions." She nodded again, the faintest smile touching her lips. "Then listen carefully. It starts with the audit I performed months before the merger, and how I discovered that nothing was as it seemed." Daniel braced himself. For the first time, he felt the full weight of the 3 years of mystery, grief, and survival pressing down, and he was ready to unravel it all. Daniel and Evelyn sat in silence for a moment. The faint rustle of leaves outside the barn the only sound between them. He watched her hands as she traced the veins on an old wooden table, fingers moving with the same precision she had once applied to laboratory equipment. She had always been meticulous, an instinct born of necessity and sharpened by intuition, and now that instinct had saved them both. "The audit," she began, voice low, "was my first step. I couldn't trust anyone else. I had to gather evidence quietly, record anomalies, and confirm the manipulations without alerting the executives. Every data sheet, every internal memo, every suppressed report, it had to be traced and cataloged. I became invisible while observing everything." Daniel leaned back, remembering the countless nights in their penthouse when Evelyn would work silently, poring over spreadsheets long after he had fallen asleep. "You did all of this, alone?" "Yes," she said simply. "I had to. Any mistake could expose the investigation, put you at risk, or worse, ensure the company would continue unethical practices unchecked." She paused, eyes distant. "The night before the accident, I realized they were onto me. That's when I staged it. The brake failure, the report of the crash, it had to be believable. It had to convince everyone I was gone." Daniel's throat tightened. He remembered the first responders, the police report, the coroner's cold detachment. He had accepted it as final. And now the reality, Evelyn alive, made the world feel fragile and trustworthy. "You didn't just survive," he said quietly, voice breaking. "You orchestrated a perfect disappearance while protecting me, and everyone else." She nodded. "I had to. The people behind the merger were ruthless. They didn't care about laws, ethics, or lives. Only profit and control. If I hadn't disappeared, they would have silenced me and you, by extension. Daniel's mind raced. Every memory of those 3 years, the grief, the hollow business meetings, the press releases suddenly carried a new weight. He had mourned her, yes, but he had also been unaware of the danger lurking behind the corporate veil. You were right, he said finally. I wasn't ready to see it then. I would have interfered in ways that could have destroyed everything. Evelyn's eyes softened. And that's why I waited. Because I knew you needed to live through those 3 years to understand the stakes, to be ready when the truth emerged. It wasn't easy, Daniel. Watching you grieve was the hardest part. But I never left entirely. I observed, I guided, I prepared. Daniel exhaled, the weight of understanding settling over him. And now, she said, we finish it. The evidence is ready. The network of corruption dismantled. All that remains is to confront them, and to reclaim what was nearly lost, the integrity of the company, the children's safety, and our lives. He reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers. You came back, not just alive, but victorious. And I have to catch up. A faint smile touched her lips, one that held both relief and pride. Then let's begin, she said, step by step, carefully. We can't afford mistakes now. Not after everything. Outside, the wind shifted, rustling the vines surrounding the barn. Daniel felt a strange combination of exhilaration and dread. The woman he thought buried had returned, not as a victim but as a strategist, a protector, and a force he had underestimated. The battle ahead would be as much about power and justice as it would be about trust and survival. He straightened, voice firm. Then show me everything. Every detail, every move. I'm ready. And Evelyn began recounting the months of meticulous planning, the hidden surveillance, the falsified reports she had corrected from the shadows. Daniel listened, absorbing each revelation with a mix of awe and horror. For 3 years, the world had believed she was dead, but she had been alive, silently reshaping reality, waiting for the right moment for him to see her, truly see her. Daniel stepped outside the barn as twilight deepened, the horizon streaked with bruised purples and golds. The vineyard beyond stretched into shadows, rows of grapevines swaying gently in the evening breeze. Every scent, every sound seemed sharper now, charged with the weight of truth Evelyn had just revealed. He had believed he understood danger, control, and power, but nothing in his billionaire life had prepared him for the meticulous orchestration of survival he had just witnessed. Do you realize what you've carried all this time? He asked, voice low. Alone, knowing everyone thought you were dead. Orchestrating every move, dismantling the corruption, protecting me and others. Evelyn didn't look away. I did what had to be done. You would have intervened. And the people we were up against, they weren't just corporate manipulators. They were ruthless, and they had influence over law enforcement, over media, over everything. You wouldn't have understood until it was over. Daniel's mind drifted back. The closed casket, the coroner's vague reassurances, the funeral attended by dozens of executives smiling politely while he mourned. Everything had been part of a carefully constructed illusion. Every moment of grief had been real, but orchestrated, a shield she had built around him. Then the accident, the brake failure. He asked, his voice tight. Her lips pressed together briefly. It was staged. I knew I couldn't disappear otherwise. They were monitoring my every move. I needed to be gone, completely gone. Only then could I finish gathering evidence and ensure the company, and you, remained safe. He clenched his fists, the rage and relief twisting together. 3 years? I've been living with this grief, thinking I buried you. And all the while, you were alive, surviving, fighting, protecting. Yes, she said softly. And every choice came at a cost. I had to isolate myself. I couldn't see anyone I loved. I couldn't risk exposure. It was lonely, terribly lonely, but it was the only way. Daniel's chest ached with the realization. He had spent 3 years in mourning, rebuilding his life, navigating a world that had no sense of the real danger lurking behind the merger. Every business decision, every philanthropic act, every handshake in boardrooms had been underpinned by lies and threats he didn't even know existed. And the people behind the merger? He asked, voice firm. The executives, the manipulators. What happens now? Evelyn's eyes darkened. They think I'm gone, but I've prepared. Every report, every internal communication, every piece of falsified data has been corrected and documented. The network is being dismantled quietly, strategically. By the time they realize I'm alive, it will be too late for them to retaliate. Daniel's thoughts turned inward. He had always believed his wealth and influence made him untouchable, that a calculated strategy could control outcomes. Evelyn had just shown him a different kind of strategy, one of patience, foresight, and sacrifice. You weren't just surviving, he said, voice low. You were orchestrating victory from the shadows. Yes, she said, voice steady. And now that the risk is reduced, I can return to the life I left behind, but things will be different. We will be different. He exhaled slowly, feeling the tension drain from his shoulders. I don't know if I can ever forgive myself for doubting you, for being blind to everything that was happening. You weren't blind, she said softly. You just didn't have the information yet, and you can't forgive what you didn't know. That's the point. The sky above them darkened into deep indigo. Stars began to prick the horizon, faint and steady. Daniel looked at Evelyn and realized that for 3 years, he had been living in half-truths, shadows, and grief. Now, standing here, he saw her fully, strategist, protector, survivor, and the woman he had loved before she vanished. I'm here, he said finally, voice firm, and I want to help. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Evelyn allowed herself a small, relieved smile. Then we begin, carefully, strategically. And we finish this, for everyone who can't protect themselves. The wind rustled through the vineyard, carrying a scent of earth and grapes. Daniel felt a strange combination of fear and exhilaration. The woman he had thought buried had returned, not as a victim but as a force he had underestimated. And together, they would confront the hidden dangers, reclaim what had been stolen, and rewrite the story of the past 3 years. Daniel and Evelyn stood at the edge of the vineyard under a sky slowly fading into midnight. The air was cool, scented with damp earth and the faint sweetness of grapes. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, the whisper of the wine felt amplified, each carrying the weight of the past 3 years. Here, at the outskirts of a town that had seen her death, Daniel finally confronted the depth of Evelyn's choices, and the gravity of what they had to do next. Everything is ready, she said, her voice steady but laced with tension. The evidence has been compiled, documented, and sent to the right people. By morning, the corrupt executives will have nowhere to hide. Daniel exhaled slowly. He had spent his life controlling outcomes, yet nothing had prepared him for orchestrating justice with someone whose strategy had always outpaced his. And you? He asked, voice soft. You're not just alive, you're leading this. Yes, she said, but only because it had to be done carefully. Subtlety, patience, precision. You'll see the full scope when we start implementing the plan together. But first, you need to understand the risks we've avoided so far. He nodded, memories of the last 3 years pressing in. The funeral he had attended in grief, the legal documents he had signed, the empty penthouse hall had been part of a plan orchestrated by her to protect him and the integrity of the company. He remembered watching the casket lower, swallowing the disbelief that she could really be gone, never imagining she was alive. Maneuvering in the shadows to dismantle corruption, and the merger, he said finally. All of it, the falsified reports, the suppressed trial data. What happens now? Evelyn's eyes hardened with determination. Exposure, transparency, accountability. The board will be forced to halt the deal. Regulators will review the corrected data. And the executives responsible, they'll face consequences they thought I could never enforce while dead. Daniel's mind raced, connecting threads. Every missed call, every delayed report, every minor decision he had made suddenly carried new weight. Evelyn had acted alone, yet with an invisible hand guiding justice. And in doing so, she had ensured the protection of children, the company, and him. I underestimated you, he admitted, voice low. 3 years of grief. And you were orchestrating all this behind the scenes. I didn't see it coming. She smiled faintly, a hint of warmth returning to her eyes. You weren't supposed to see it coming. That was the point. Timing, Daniel. Timing is everything. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint scent of soil and life. Daniel realized, with a shiver of awe, that the woman before him was not only the Evelyn he had loved but also a strategist, protector, and survivor beyond measure. She had survived 3 years in isolation, dismantling a network of corruption, and still returned with her mission intact and with him still standing by her side. Then we move forward, Daniel said finally. Together, every step, every challenge, every risk. Yes, she said, but carefully. We cannot afford mistakes now. Not after everything. He reached for her hand. It was small, warm, and steady. For the first time in years, he felt hope, clarity, and a renewed sense of purpose. The pain of loss was still there, but it had transformed into determination to reclaim what had been stolen, to face the truth, and to rebuild their lives together. The night deepened around them, the vineyard bathed in moonlight. Stars pricked the sky like silent witnesses to the reunion and the plans yet to unfold. Daniel looked at Evelyn and saw a future that had seemed impossible 3 years ago. A future where survival, courage, and love had triumphed over deception, grief, and fear. "This isn't over," she said, eyes meeting his. "But now, we're ready. We finally have the chance to set things right." Daniel nodded, squeezing her hand. "Then let's begin." And together, the billionaire and the woman he thought he had buried stepped into the night, not as victims of circumstance but as architects of justice, survival, and a second chance at life.